Welcome everyone, I am Raquel De Haro from ETH Center for Law and Economics, and it is my pleasure to introduce you Professor Anu Bradford from Columbia Law School. Professor Bradford is the one who coined the term Brussels effect, and she's the author of the influential books The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, and Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology. And today we will discuss her recent paper, The False Choice Between Digital Regulation and Innovation. So welcome, Anu.
So delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before we dive into the details of the paper, we wanted to know what is the background that motivated you to write about this paper, and also what made you challenge this common assumption that innovation and regulation are always incompatible?
So I think it's well understood that there has been this tsunami of digital regulation coming out of Brussels. So whether it's the antitrust cases against tech companies, the privacy regulations, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, so content moderation, also IP in the digital setting. So Brussels is very well known as the regulatory superpower. But at the same time, it often takes a room full of people a while to name a European tech company. So all these tech giants are coming from the United States and also from China. So there just seemed to be this perception that these two developments are inherently connected, that it is because of the EU's commitment to regulate this space, we don't see technological innovations coming from Europe. So somehow the reason why there is this innovation gap between the US and the EU is because the US has chosen this free market model, they don't regulate, whereas the Europeans have been regulating. And to me that has always felt like a very simplistic narrative. So if we even think about how far back the European digital regulations go, there was very little before 2010 when these cases against tech companies started in the antitrust space. There was the 1995 Data Privacy Directive, but that was not particularly constraining. Yet, if you look back at 1998 or 2004 when Facebook and Google were founded, those companies were founded in the US and not in the EU. So I wanted to embark on this intellectual journey to try to then unpack this relationship between digital regulation and innovation and see whether that is the reason the Europeans are not performing as well, or whether there's something else that is driving this technological gap.
And in this sense, this leads me to the next question, that is, if you could provide examples where actually regulation can even foster innovation.
Yeah, so absolutely. If we think about, for instance, the data privacy, yes, in many ways it at least advances social innovation. It enhances our fundamental right to privacy, our self-determination, our personal autonomy. But in many ways, we think about privacy also as a quality feature of products. It brings then products and services to consumers that they inherently value when they want to have less privacy invasive digital technologies. And then there are examples of companies like Apple that have very successfully monetized this pro-privacy model that is very inherent to all Apple product development. The same way I would say about AI, the consumers, we are generally excited about AI, but we're also very concerned about various risks. So for there to be real uptake for these technologies, there needs to be a trust that these risks are being mitigated, they are being governed, they are being controlled. And this way, if consumers know that these companies are abiding by a set of regulations designed to mitigate those risks and protect their privacy and so forth, that can also then lead to a more robust market opportunity for these technologies.
And I think now this debate has even reached top EU officials, and we risk that instead of maybe following some of the suggestions that you talk about in the paper on bankruptcy law and like capital markets, we might risk that they don't enforce the EU rules that they created for this. So like what's your opinion on that?
That's exactly right, Raquel. So what I see right now is that there is both an external and internal threat to European digital regulations. First, there's an external threat coming from the Trump administration, where the US is extremely concerned about these regulations apparently targeting unfairly American tech giants, and they are pushing back and basically asking the Europeans to walk away from this regulatory agenda, else face tariffs. But there's also internal development where the Europeans seem to be now losing their confidence in their rights-driven digital regulatory model. And that is because the Europeans are now very focused on competitiveness and very focused on the need to generate greater technological sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and palpably aware of this massive gap where the Europeans are dependent on American technologies and they need to now de-risk from an increasingly unreliable United States as a partner. So the Europeans are now, in my view, falsely equating this peril that they find themselves in terms of technological development with their commitment to digital regulation. We now talk about simplifying and potentially moving to less stringent regulatory regime. But here I hope that my paper makes a contribution because I argue that the stringent digital regulations play a very small part in this story of explaining the innovation deficit, if you like. Instead, I think the real reasons that explain why the EU is behind the US is that there is no digital single market in the EU. Tech companies need to scale across 27 different markets. Second, there's no deep, robust capital markets union. It is much harder for the tech companies to fund their innovations in the EU. In the US, they benefit from a vibrant venture capital market. The EU tech companies do well in the first few funding rounds, but as soon as they need more money, they need to turn to American venture capital or American tech giants acquire them. So again, not the story of the GDPR holding them back, it's really the availability of the capital in the US and unavailability in the EU. But then I also talk about legal frameworks and cultural attitudes towards risk-taking. Entrepreneurship, especially tech entrepreneurship, is very risky. So you need to allow the entrepreneurs to fail. And Europeans have some of the most stringent bankruptcy laws in the world. You start a company, you fail, you're done. You never raise money again. Whereas in the US, it's built into the entire venture capital system. There's also much less cultural stigma around failure in the US. So that is more conducive to innovation. As a final thing, I would say that the big difference between the US and the EU is that the US has been tremendously successful in attracting global talent to benefit the US innovation ecosystem. Over half of the over $1 billion tech startups have an immigrant founder in the US. And the Europeans have not created similar pathways for immigration whereby this tech talent would have been coming to Europe. Here's an opportunity though, because now the US policies are moving away from embracing innovation. So there's potentially a lot of talent on the loose looking for another home. So my hope is, and this would be a message to the decision makers in the EU as well, is that this is an opportunity to really start addressing some of these weaknesses of the tech ecosystem, including the idea of trying to find a way to find a pathways for the talent to come to the EU instead of the US.
So thank you, Anu. That was very interesting, and your thought always makes us rethink our assumptions about innovation and digital regulation.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And for our viewers, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did, and see you next time.